Hello, welcome to this presentation on Maculate reflexivities. Are the universities losing the plot? My name is Rainer Brauer and I will be giving this presentation to you today. The aim of this presentation is to critically assess the emergent discourse around research impact that is increasingly used to justify the raison d'etre of modern Western universities. And we want to use the concept of Maculate reflexivity to comment upon these concurrent developments. The structure of the presentation is as follows. First, we have to start with the background information and introduce the idea of research impact, and describe the context of research evaluation in which this idea is currently being operationalized. Afterwards, we want to lift the gaze and focus on universities as organizations from a more general perspective. The perspective is, well, what are the purposes of a university? And this in practice is what is being evaluated by research assessment and the judgments upon research impact. We then introduce our theoretical concept of maculate reflexivity, define how we understand it, and the theoretical background we depart from it when introducing this idea. We provide 3 examples afterwards of what we understand to be maculated reflexivity around research impact, to highlight how this occurs in practice within the context of research impact evaluation. We finish with a brief discussion and a conclusion on what we think the collective consequences are for the dynamic we are observing. When we talk about the idea of research impact, we have to distinguish between a theoretical understanding and the practical implementation of that very idea. Theoretically, research impact as an idea describes the consequences of research in terms of societal influence that research has. What is important to note here is that this understanding is value neutral, in the sense that research impact can have a positive influence or a negative influence upon society, as society is the entity that is being inferred to when impact occurs. If no influence upon society occurs, then we can't really talk about research impact. Practically, within the UK, research impact is utilized by the UK government as an evaluation criteria for the higher education sector. Specifically, within the Research Excellence Framework, in 2014, the evaluation of research impact was formally introduced. The Research Excellence Framework is a successor of what was previously known as the Research Assessment Exercise, which has represented a nationalized assessment of research within the UK from 1986. These very exercises are held roughly every 7 years, and the next one was somewhat delayed due to the COVID pandemic, and is now expected to be held in the beginning of 2021. To answer the question of what the purpose of a university is, represents a very difficult question, as there are competing interpretations of that very purpose. Nevertheless, for sake of simplifying, let's identify 3 broad categories that describe the general agreed-upon purposes. The first being a commitment to the advancement of knowledge, which can be seen as a reincarnation of the religious history of a university. Here the purpose of a university is to tend to the spiritual and moral character of society, to borrow Wilhelm von Humboldt's words. The second purpose that we can identify is a social contract view that sees the primary purpose of a university to aid and support the betterment of society. Such a view is, for example, advocated by funding bodies within their focus on research impact. Last but not least, we have what we call the neoliberal view, which represents this view that the universities are for is to provide an efficient workforce for industry and for the individuals themselves so that they can get degrees which allows them to get high-paying jobs, which is something that is used by marketing, for example, to attract new students or investors to the universities. The reason of why we introduce these 3 different purposes is that these outline different ideological views. And it's because depending upon which the individual departs from, determines if how our subsequent narration is understood as a genuine problem, as scaremongering, or what is being described as actually desired. And this is what we want to comment upon now when we're talking about maculate reflexivity. Describing the idea of maculate reflexivity is rather straightforward. Really appreciating its implication is not so much. The reason is that our human cognition has an upper limit. And we don't care if you are the smartest person to have ever lived. It is very unlikely that you can appreciate the complexity that is involved with all 7+ billion people that are alive today, and hence our tendencies to simplify. Now, within our process of simplification, we can make cognitive operations about these simplifications, and that is usually what is being regarded as being reflective. However, we cannot be reflective about causal processes, which mechanisms we do not understand, and have already simplified their dynamics, with the theoretical models we are implying. Now, what is important to realize here is that whilst we have difficulties in appreciating the consequences of certain actions, the actual causality is unencumbered by such personal limitations. The idea of unintended consequences has been utilized to describe these outcomes of such actions, when our own or others' action generate outcomes that were not intended within the process. Before we start to provide a few examples of Maculate reflexivity within the context of a C assessment of research impact, let's just spend a few seconds commenting upon our methodology here. We have deliberately chosen to utilize abstract example without providing concrete empirical details of the dynamic that we are describing. The reason for that is that we want to highlight that such a process of Maculate reflexivity can occur even within the most reflective process we know of, namely research. If we provide concrete examples, what then can occur is that the focus shifts to the actual individual that is being described, and the dynamic that we are describing becomes a reflection of their character or intellectual capabilities. Firstly, we argue, this process that we are describing can occur even in the most intelligent and reflective of us. Secondly, we similarly maintain that most of the examples we described are indeed well-intentioned. Nevertheless, there can be undesirable consequences that are not obvious to the individuals that are engaged with them in the moment. What we are describing here is a highly complex process, and this applies to all forms of social systems. But here we are specifically focusing on the conduct of universities within the context of research impact evaluation. Okay, let's come to the big elephant in the room. If the universities are embracing research impact, getting evaluated by it, receive government funding in terms of direct investment or research grants, or use it in terms of to market themselves in order to attract students, then any claims in regard to research objectivity become null and void. Research impact, per its definition, is meant as a process that influences society, and therefore different individuals will have competing impressions about the outcome if that influence is desirable or not. Furthermore, from a research integrity perspective, it matters a lot if this influence upon society is intended as a direct goal, or if it happens as an indirect consequences of the intellectual research interest of the researchers. In the latter position, when the ideas are being implemented by others independently of the researcher can maintain a position of intellectual integrity. When the researcher is directly expected within their research impact activities to lobby and interfere with society, such a position of integrity becomes a lot harder to defend. As mentioned before, practical implementation of research impact comes with its own challenges. One of these challenges is that research impact is assessed based on what is called impact case studies. These impact case studies, based on the practicality of the assessment, have definite boundaries. For example, within the context of the research excellence framework, these are that the details of research impact are expected to be described within 750 words, with the use of 10 sources to corroborate the impact, and where the research had to be published within the past 20 years, and the impact has occurred within the past 7. If these requirements are not met, then the research impact technically becomes unclassified and worthless by extension. Now this creates a selection pressure of where researchers are being incentivized to focus on short-term outcomes. We argue this not only leads to a gamification of research impact, but also artificially restricts and curbs research that is not suited for these short time frames or to be articulated within these short formats. The last example that we want to mention pertains to the specific structure of the evaluation process, in that the universities are using the examples of research impact that in order to be positively assessed. With this choice, we have already introduced a sampling bias into the selection of research impact. Furthermore, research may have had undesirable consequences upon society, but firstly, nobody would take responsibility for it, and secondly, nobody is incentivized to focus on it if it occurs on a longer time span than what is being assessed, and therefore we may not be even aware if it has a negative impact or not. Thereby, we argue, innovation within the framing of the assessment that shapes the university context may indeed be happening. However, the very innovation by the nature of the assessment structure is unaware of its own consequences, as only the positive examples are being selected and celebrated and financially awarded, and then furthermore being translated into career advancement and the selection of what is worth to study and consequently research. The dangers we speak of are as of yet only potential, but when implemented for a number of decades, they will get more pronounced. But nobody of the individuals that occupy positions of authority by then will notice them, because they will have become normalized. If the universities want to actively utilize research impact as an argument for their existence, this by default means that they will take a political position. Secondly, the evaluation methods that they use to identify what type of impact they have not only have a sampling bias towards positive examples, they also create a blindness for negative outcomes of what is not being measured. For the sake of argumentation, let's say that universities adopt a focus when they want to promote a betterment for society. Well, the mechanizations of any assessment structure will generate that it deteriorates into a game-playing exercise to find the best examples to fill out the assessment forms. Now, researchers may then be able to lament such a development as externally introduced as neoliberal focus, and then we are not personally okay with that. However, they are manifesting maculated reflexivity towards their own conduct if they are just participating in such a process. We argue, only when the advancement of knowledge remains the highest goal of any research impact process can such a dynamic be prevented. Unfortunately, we don't really have the time here now to go into the dynamics of how this functions, but at least we hope that we were able to outline and describe the problem that we are observing. In conclusion, research impact is neither good nor bad, it just is. If we do not influence other people with our research, we are not engaged in a scholarly community, so that part isn't optional. Hence, it all depends on how we do it, and for what purpose. We argue, when the purpose of scholarship shifts from the advancement of knowledge to that of creating a better society or pursuing any other purpose, maculate reflexivity will ensue. And the unintended consequences will manifest slowly and gradually in that the people become blind to the systems of measurements that they're using that is being normalized. What then occurs is a natural cultural shift where the mechanization of the system become outdated to the loss of innovation on the level that matters, meaning critical towards one's own conduct. Henceforth, self-gratification and easy measurability take over that conditions the individual to be self-righteous, until the system collapses or gets outcompeted by a more agile one. So yeah, thank you very much for listening, and if you have any questions, please do get in contact. And I would like to keep this conversation going, because we do think it's a really, really important issue that is not being appreciated to the amount that is being important.